after careful reflection, I have concluded that the very high threshold required for the invocation of the Act was met.
Obviously, it took failures. It took systems that weren't able to solve a situation that ideally would have been able to solve by a robust set of institutions and principles like we have in Canada, that we would need to invoke an Emergencies Act.
This was an emergency that Justin Trudeau created by attacking his own population, by driving up their cost of living, by making it impossible for people to pay their bills and live their lives in peace.
Just some of the comments here in Ottawa today after a busy day. The inquiry into the federal government's use of the Emergencies Act found, as you heard there, that the government met the high legal threshold to use it. What else does the report tell us about the government's use of the Act, and what political lessons are there? We've assembled a special Friday at issue, because why not? Andrew Coyne, Althea Raj, and in for Chantal Hébert, Gary Mason tonight. Good to see you all. Appreciate you doing this on a Friday. Andrew, were you surprised that Justice Rouleau found that the government had met this legal threshold?
Not particularly. There's not a great deal of surprise in the report to anybody who was paying attention. It mostly confirms what people who didn't have ideological axes to grind would have gleaned already from the evidence. But that's useful and important to have somebody manifestly fair looking at this and coming to a very reasoned judgment on this about the evidence in front of it. And just retelling the events is as important as anything else.
Sure.
But on the particular issue of whether the government was justified, whether it met the threshold, too much attention was paid to the question of whether the CSIS standard had been met, et cetera. What was really the important language in the Act is, did the government have reasonable grounds to believe that there was a public emergency? And the judge found absolutely they did, that the notion that this was just a peaceful protest full of people face painting and dancing just simply did not accord with the facts, that there was rising tide of aggressive rhetoric coming from people in there. There were bad actors in the middle there with who knows what kinds of agendas. You had copycat protests popping up all across the country. And so a government could reasonably look at this and say, in the face of just a complete and total breakdown of the police ability to deal with this, that something more had to be done.
Right, that the security threat was real and that the context around all of this mattered too. Althea, was there anything in there that you could see as an important lesson for a government going forward, or for this government in particular?
Well, there were a lot of strong words for the Ontario government, which shirked its responsibility with regards to Ottawa. The commissioner actually goes to great pains to point out that Ottawa is a municipality, and that is a creature of the province, and therefore the province has the jurisdiction over policing in Ottawa. And that Doug Ford's government wouldn't go to the trilateral talks, and that if there had been more coordination earlier on, that perhaps we wouldn't have had the situation that required the federal government invoking the Emergencies Act. But I was actually quite surprised to the extent to which Commissioner Rouleau went to agree with the government, not just on the expanded definition of whether or not you need to abide by the CSIS definition of the Act as per CSIS's interpretation of it, but even on matters where you thought he might have been critical, like how the fact the government did not give the commissioner their legal opinion. Yep. He says, oh, well, I didn't really need it. I can make my opinion without actually having it. Or that one of his strongest criticisms is about the fact that there is no kind of way for you to get off the frozen bank account list after you've left Ottawa. And he's like, well, I'm convinced that if the protest had lasted longer and the measures had lasted longer, that the government would have gone and fixed this. So, there are several points where he could have been a little bit more firm, but he sides with the government. He agrees with the government on they shouldn't have spoken to the protesters. That was understandable. The meeting with the premiers, he thinks that amounted to consultation. So many points of disagreement with different partners involved in the commission. He sides with the government. So to me, the whole taken together suggests that if another government had not acted this way, well, then the government would have shirked its responsibilities. He's so glowing in his praise.
So does that mean it's a vindication in some ways, Gary, for the government and what they did here?
I don't know if I suppose it is, but I think that most fair-minded Canadians, totally sided with the government right from the beginning. I think there was probably a lot of Canadians were wondering why we were even having an inquiry into this, even though it's mandated under the law as soon as you use the Emergencies Act. I thought, to me, one of the most interesting things in the report was his view that federalism failed in this case, that in order for this country to work, that politicians, our political leaders, need to set aside their partisan interests for the common good. And that clearly did not happen here. I think Doug Ford clearly, he didn't listen. He didn't want to get involved until the Ambassador Bridge was shut down and the economy, his economy was really going to get hit hard, and the calls to his office started, and that's when he responded. But until then, he didn't want to have anything to do with it because the federal Conservatives were pandering to this group. They thought this was a group that was in their best interest to pander to. I think this, as Althea says, I think this is a real indictment of Doug Ford's leadership in a time of real crisis in this country.
Andrew, do you agree with that? And do you think that this report now sort of mutes or blunts anything federal Conservatives can say about the way the government acted?
Yeah, I think you could tell that from the body language and the response from the Conservatives. They want this to go away pretty quickly. I don't think if it had been a much more critical report, they would have been riding it all the way to next election. But I don't think they want to talk about this much more anymore. I think what this report brings out is that the issue here was much less to do with whether or not the Emergencies Act should have been invoked, but how on earth did we get here, and the many failures at all levels that led to that. I think he does a real service in just explaining to people what actually is in the Emergencies Act. A lot of the hysteria around this was based on the idea that this was something tantamount to martial law, and it fundamentally isn't. It is strictly time limited with about 6 layers of oversight and rather limited powers that it gives the government to what it can actually do. And we saw that in the use of it to basically, commandeer a few trucks, freeze some bank accounts for a couple of days. And not much more than that. So I think understanding that this is not the War Measures Act, this was the bill that was brought in to replace the War Measures Act and to learn the lessons of the War Measures Act. I think if anything's been vindicated, it's the Emergencies Act itself.
Well, he even says, Althea, and last word to you, that it's not dictatorial, contrary to the way some people were trying to frame it as the government was using it.
That's true. He does make 2 criticisms of the government that I think are worth talking about. He specifically points the finger at Justin Trudeau twice in the overview volume. I'll be honest, it's the only part, it's like almost 300 pages, only part I read today. So maybe he points the finger elsewhere as well. But he says that Justin Trudeau, in calling the protesters a small fringe minority, and also referencing another press conference where he talked about conspiracy theorists with tinfoil hats and focusing on the protesters who danced on the war memorial, who carried Confederate flags and Nazi flags, that he made the problem worse, that he emboldened the protesters. He made the protesters distress government. He probably made the thing last longer. And so I think that's noteworthy. And obviously the Prime Minister came out and for the first time acknowledged that he should have chosen his words more carefully. Yeah. And we've been asking him this for almost a year and a half, and this is the first time he came out. Pierre Poilievre, though, used those words to suggest that the government had caused the protest. The other point, briefly, I'll make is Marco Mendicino the Public Safety Minister, telling committee and the House that he acted on the advice of law enforcement officials. Justice Rouleau doesn't point the finger at Marco Mendicino, but one of his recommendations is that those law enforcement officials should put their opinion in writing.
Yeah. Gary, I'll give you 20 seconds and then I'll got to take a quick break.
Yeah, no, I think that, the criticism of Justin Trudeau for some of the language that he used was fair. However, I would say that most of the protesters, certainly those that arrived from the West, were not fans of Justin Trudeau long before he uttered those words. In fact, this was an anti-Trudeau rally that was formed in thought and manner and planning long before he made those comments. So, to blame this kind of on him or inflaming this situation is maybe a little bit much. Maybe he could have used his language more conservatively, but these people were anti-Trudeau people years ago.
He is perfectly happy to let a foreign authoritarian government interfere in our elections as long as they're helping him. And according to the Globe and Mail story today, this foreign authoritarian government wanted to see Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister because they knew that he would work for their interests rather than Canada's interest.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre there responding to the Globe and Mail story today. CSIS documents that outlined China's strategy to try and meddle in the last election, documents that Globe and Mail reporters looked at. What implications could this have for the Liberals? At Issue is back. Andrew, Althea, and Gary. Andrew, you start us off on this one. How troubling is this to you, these revelations? How damaging is this for the government?
Hugely troubling and potentially enormously damaging. I think much worse in its implications than the Emergencies Act. It's bad enough that the Chinese were not just interfering in our elections, and it appears in 2 straight elections, but they weren't doing it randomly. They were doing it with the particular purpose of electing Liberals and preventing Conservatives from being elected. Now, presumably the only reason they did that was for reasons that the public positions the government has taken and for which they can be held to account. But the evidence is that the security people were preparing documents and briefing the government and or the Prime Minister going back not just to this last election, but going back some years. There's been some stories going back as far as 2017. So if they knew about this, and that remains to be seen how much they knew, but it'd be hard to believe they didn't know something as important as this. If they knew about this, what, if anything, did they do about it? And certainly they don't seem to have told anybody. They just simply sat on this information, didn't tell the public, didn't tell the candidates who were the targets of the conservative, of the disinformation campaigns. So to just sort of sit there and accept the help, if you will, I mean, Pierre Poilievre put it a little too strongly, but not a whole lot. It's really troubling in its implications.
Althea?
The government needs to be more transparent about what it knows, what it knew, when it knew it, and why it didn't tell anybody. To kind of harken back to the previous topic, when you're talking about conspiracy theorists, there are a lot on the internet. And if the government doesn't want people to believe that the election was stolen, they need to be more transparent. And the answer that the Prime Minister gave today did not actually offer any answers. Prior to the last election, or 2019, the government created this panel of deputy ministers and experts who were supposed to warn us if there was anything like this. And they didn't say anything in 2019, and they didn't say anything in 2021. So why not? And is there a failure? Did this information not reach them, or did they not do their jobs, or were they too afraid to do their job? There's a lot of questions.
Or did they not deem it worthy of flagging? I mean, because we don't really know. We don't know that part either.
We don't know.
Yeah.
And part of the Globe and Mail's reporting also suggests that there's a kickback scheme. I mean, that's election fraud. So why is there no follow-up from other election agencies like Elections Canada or the RCMP?
Right.
So there's a lot of questions, and the longer they go unanswered, the more it's going to fuel people who think that the last election was unfair. Maybe the one before that too.
I will just say, because we didn't play the clip, though, that the Prime Minister again today said that he has been told that it did not affect the outcome of the election in 2019 or 2021.
Doesn't give answers to that.
No,
we
100%,
only have
yes.
his word, right?
That's
And
right.
I think that's why they need to be more transparent.
Gary.
Yeah, I was really puzzled by the Prime Minister's comments today about that, Rosie. I mean, he sort of blithely dismissed the whole thing and suggested that he's known for years, it's been out there for years, that there's foreign countries trying to meddle in our elections, but it's not something that we need to worry about, and that it didn't affect the outcome of any of the races. Well, I just don't know how he knows that, and how can he say that? How does he know that some of this disinformation that was spread out there about certain Conservative candidates didn't have an impact on the base result of a particular race? I don't think there's any way that he can say that with any kind of authority. I think that this is a very serious issue, as Andrew says, and I think it warrants much more serious and a deeper investigation than what the Prime Minister indicated today that he's prepared to do with this. I think this is a really big deal in this country, and it's one of the biggest stories to come along in a long time, and it needs to be taken much more seriously than it appears to be taken right now.
Just quickly, Andrew, yeah.
And a serious and an independent investigation. It is not going to be enough for Liberals to investigate Liberals on something like this.
or for it to be done at a parliamentary committee, which is where it is now as well. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you all for being here on a Friday. Althea, Andrew, thanks for coming back. Gary, a pleasure to welcome you here as well. Now I'll send things back to Anita in Vancouver.